Liam of Carcanne. Chapter 3, Bullies and Bureaucrats. Part 1. Scents of wood and dried pine needles poured into Liam's mind as he fought against the tug of consciousness. For the first time since falling onto his cot in the early morning hours, his sleep was dreamless, and he wished to revel in it a bit longer. Sadly, though, Liam fell into the same familiar trap as many desperate sleepers before him. In trying to force himself back to sleep, he only woke himself up more, and with each passing moment, he was steadily dragged back into the waking world. The smell of the woodshed flooding into his nose was the last omen that his battle was at an end. There was no amount of tossing and turning that would save him now. Reluctantly, he let his eyes open. Light seeped into the windowless shack through the cracks around the door and in the walls, basking the room in false twilight. Stacked against the back wall of the room were pieces of firewood left over from the colder winter months, and it was their smell that permeated the space. Shoved up against the final stack of firewood was Liam's cot, taking up most of the free space left in the shed. Aside from the wood and the cot, the only items in the room were the small collection of Liam's belongings, which he had arranged on some strategically placed logs, and an axe hanging on some pegs next to the door. Liam lay in bed for another long minute with his eyes focused on the underside of the thatched roof of his makeshift room. As long as the day before had been, his night had felt even longer. After the long, uneventful walk of shame back into Stawson, he had stumbled his way into bed long after the rest of the town had gone to sleep. For hours he struggled to join them, before finally falling into a fitful slumber. Nightmares were nothing new for him, not since arriving in Carcanne. Unsurprisingly, this wasn't his first time having nightmares of the wolf-like Vargr creatures. These dreams, however, were so much worse than any before. Over and over again, he relived the chase across the plain from the previous day. Sometimes he succeeded in escaping the beast. Sometimes he was the man he had pulled from the wreckage as the Vargr devoured him. Again, the crunching and grinding sound of the creature's last meal flooded his ears, and he shot bolt upright in his bed. Suddenly, finding himself sitting, Liam flung his legs off the side of the cot and immediately felt a sharp pain as something heavy smacked into his shin. Recoiling, he pulled his assaulted leg up onto the bed and rubbed at the offending area. Glancing down to the floor, his eyes fell on the pommel of the short sword Odel had strapped to the pack he'd gifted Liam before they parted ways. The pack that, according to Odel, the family gifted him. Still rubbing at his shin, Liam pulled his eyes from the pack and pinned his gaze onto the door at the far side of the shed to avoid looking at it. After a moment, Liam could make out details of the overturned cart and the grain of the wooden door. The sounds of the snarling Vargr drifted into his ears again, and he violently shook his head to clear his thoughts. Releasing his leg, he gingerly set his foot back on the floor and rose from the bed. Liam sought comfort in the normalcy of his morning routine. He started by washing off the grime from the journey. Typically, he'd have eaten breakfast after his morning sponge bath, but no such provisions had been made for this morning. He was supposed to have woken up in the fort, after all. Instead, he set to dressing himself in his last clean set of underclothes. The light fabric stuck to his damp skin and made dressing more difficult than it needed to be, but he managed. After sliding into a set of the outerwear Denholm had bought for him, Liam sat on the edge of his cot and pulled on his socks. Instinctively, he reached for his shoes, but did not find them next to the bed where he usually left them. Across the room, sitting in a pile next to the door, lay his trusty pair of limited edition Converse All-Stars. They had seen him through a lot the last week, and it showed. The once squeaky clean white lines of the soles were covered in mud and muck. The custom-printed canvas was so covered in mud, grime, and he was pretty sure wolf hair that he couldn't make out the trademark logo on the ankle. Worst of all, at least for his plans to continue wearing them for the next few days, they lay in a small puddle of water that had leached out of the shoes and onto the floor overnight. Liam didn't need to touch them to know they were soaked to the soles and would be downright painful to wear. Reluctantly, his head turned to the fresh pair of black boots hanging from the pack at his feet. They were far nicer than anything the family themselves had been wearing, and must have been part of the goods they were carrying to whatever market when Liam shook his head again to refocus on the shoes. Black, calf-length boots made of thick leather at their base, with more supple leather used to wrap the calves of the wearer in relative comfort. Liam was surprised to find the pair fit him well enough, but was unsurprised that his socks, meant for his high tops, were not nearly long enough to protect his legs from the leather of the boots. He tried to stuff the length of his trousers into the tops to help with the rubbing, but the material proved too thick to slide into the space between the skin and leather. Reluctantly, Liam reached over and pulled the pack onto his lap. For a long moment he sat and stared at the gift and contemplated whether to open it. Pulling the boots on had been a necessity, and he supposed so did searching the bag for a pair of socks, but it still felt like crossing a line. The clothes inside belonged to the dead. They had been taken from the wreckage of their final resting place. Opening the pack felt far too much to Liam like grave robbing. He set the pack back on the ground next to the bed and stood up in the boots. The soft leather rubbed at his unprotected calves, and he made his way to the door. In the garden, the bright spring sun cast no shadows as it perched atop its zenith. There was little shade within the walls of the church. What there was had been specifically designed by Denholm to cover the plants that required less light, and it was mostly cast by small, well-pruned fruit trees. As always, the air in the walled garden felt different from the air outside. Here it was always thicker and smelled slightly of the ground after a hard rain. Liam had inquired of Denholm why that was, and the priest admitted he hadn't noticed it before. He had then set about walking in and out of the gardens for a while to test Liam's statement, and began planning to see if it were that way at other churchyards the next time he went traveling. Such moments were the reason it hadn't taken Liam long to understand Denholm. His drive to experience the world he believed his goddess had created, and willingness to help anyone in it, was just ingrained into who he was. Liam rounded the corner of the chapel and found Denholm locked in conversation with a boy no more than 12. The child's arms were filled to overflowing with different vegetables from the garden. Denholm's disappointment that the boy couldn't carry more was palpable even from across the courtyard. "You make sure your mother gets these," the priest was saying to the boy. "And if she needs any more, you be sure to come back and get it." "Yes, Father," the boy replied while struggling not to drop a precariously perched cucumber. The child spotted Liam coming around the corner and did his best to nod politely to the stranger. The motion caused the loss of a carrot, but Denholm picked it up and replaced it on the top of the stack. "All right, then," he said, turning to look at what had distracted the boy over his shoulder. "You run along." "Yes, sir." The young man stepped back away from the priest and headed slowly for the gate. With each step, the pile of vegetables shifted, but to Liam's surprise, he made it out onto the street without dropping any more produce. "Remember," Denholm called after the child, "there's more if you need it, but next time don't forget your basket." A muffled cry of "Yes, sir" floated through the open gate, followed by the sound of a multitude of vegetables hitting the ground and a defeated sigh. "You're home early," Denholm said, turning his attention to Liam. "Did you run back from the fort?" Technically I never made it to the fort." Liam rubbed his palms together nervously. "No?" Denholm's disappointment didn't show on his face, but Liam could still sense its presence. "No, I only made it a little way past the river," Liam explained. "There was an incident." Unexpected tears formed in the corners of Liam's eyes. He felt in control of his emotions, but still they insisted on arriving. Maybe it was in case they felt needed. "What kind of incident?" The priest ushered Liam into the chapel and onto the pews at the back of the room, as the younger man relayed the events that befell him on the highway. Liam stayed surprisingly calm, the tears only falling from his eyes when the images appearing before them needed washing away. Just as he had when they first met, Denholm sat and listened intently, only interrupting to offer encouragement or ask a clarifying question. Over the course of an hour or better, Liam laid out all of the events of his day and didn't stop until he reached the moment he walked around the corner of the church that morning. With everything said, the two sat in silence for a while, the quiet hanging heavy in the room between them. "I should never have asked you to go," Denholm introduced quiet words into the stillness. The words were simple, but the underlying criticism against himself was harsh. "You had no way of knowing I would run into that." Liam spoke no louder than Denholm, keeping his eyes on his friend's shoes so he didn't have to see his face. "Neither of us could have known." "Still, it was so soon after your last encounter with the wolves." "The Vargar." The emphasis Denholm placed on that correction was heavy. How could he have not realized what they were? They were infinitely more dangerous than any wolf. Liam's run from them was less heroic and more miraculous with their introduction into the story. "What you tried to do for those people, what you did do, it's nothing short of amazing." "I didn't do anything aside from almost getting myself killed again." Liam waved away the priest's praise. "Must every endeavor of yours succeed? Does every failure have to outshine every victory? When people's lives are at stake, excellence is all that matters." The words didn't come out sharp, but the dull, lifeless tone seemed to infuriate Denholm more than if they had been. Striving for excellence is one thing, but this constant need for perfection, this constant tearing down of yourself for not getting it just right, it's infuriating. Denholm ground the palms of his hands into his knees in frustration. You tried to save lives. That's better than many of the men in this world would have done. What does it matter if they still died? The world that existed inside the scope of Liam's vision stretched out as he spoke, everything other than his view of Denholm's feet becoming blurry as he pushed it aside. Sometimes the effort is more important than the result. The priest stood from his pew and walked down the aisle. He fought to keep his frustration with the boy out of his voice. Ultimately he failed, and a stern edge creeped into his words. Tell that to the family. The defeated young man's eyes never left the spot Denholm's shoes had occupied. His face remained pale and lifeless as the priest railed against the construct of Liam's personal sense of self-worth. They were already dead. You didn't have to die with them for your actions to mean something. Denholm had struck upon a theory in the short time the two had been together that Liam's homeland had done much to grind the boy's sense of value out of him. And this was all of the evidence he felt he needed to back his idea. No man should feel this guilty for surviving simply because he had tried to help. It doesn't feel that way. When Liam's head finally turned to look at Denholm, the look on his face pleaded with the man to just let him give up and wallow in his defeat. I pity a world so obsessed with success in everything that you overlook the heroism in trying. You must have gallows in every hospital for when your healers fail. That's ridiculous, Liam scoffed. People are allowed to learn from their mistakes. Then why can't you learn from this the same way? The blank stare on Liam's face showed Denholm there was no answer forthcoming. The priest took a deep breath and shook his head. He was the priest to a small congregation of believers, not the personal friar to adventurers. As much as he wanted to help Liam through this, he was unsure he was the right person for the job, or if there even was a right person. You didn't fail in saving those people, Denholm finally said, his voice still stern. He returned to his seat, feeling defeated, though he couldn't let Liam see it. You succeeded in ensuring their deaths weren't meaningless. It still doesn't feel like it. Not every win will feel like a victory. The priest's hand reached out and patted Liam's knee reassuringly. Then what's the point in winning? Liam's face turned, and the dim light from the candelabras caught across his face, highlighting the multitude of paths the tears had taken from his eyes. Odel's family own a small farm halfway between here and Dorslaw, Denholm explained as he rose from his seat again. The two had allowed time to pass between them before settling on the neutral topic of how the priest knew Odel. Their emotionally charged exchange had been the angriest Liam had seen Denholm get to date, and even though his sentiments just echoed those of Norrie on the side of the road, his words had still helped Liam. He just wasn't ready to admit it yet. They do a lot for the poor around town, even maintaining their own charity garden on their land, he continued. He grew up playing in these gardens whenever they made it into town. He's a good kid. So the letter will be safe with him? Liam asked anxiously. Denholm hadn't seemed angry when he revealed who he had left the letter with, but he still worried. Of course it will, Denholm dismissed Liam's concerns. I told you when I gave it to you that the man I usually use for such things was out of town on guild business. You meant Odel? Yeah, I knew you had good taste. Denholm smiled and patted Liam on the shoulder as the two walked out of the chapel and back into the light of early afternoon. Thank God. Liam's shoulders relaxed, and he wiped his face. Relief flooded through him as one of the minor loads he carried was relieved. Now, Norrie, I don't know as well, Denholm went on, but he's only been in town the one winter. He's from out of town? Denholm shot a glance from the corner of his eye as if questioning the validity of his words before supplying an answer anyway. Yes, he's from Mandrote. Norwood of Mandrote, Liam shook his head. Yeah, that tracks. You know, for someone so smart, you overlook the obvious quite often, Denholm said as the two men continued across the garden towards the front gate. There's a lot of people back home whose names mean things that don't apply anymore. A lot of Smiths who aren't Smiths. Cashes who don't make barrels. Wilsons whose father's names are Ted, Liam explained his oversight. Well, not here, Denholm explained. Names still mean what they say. Norrie is from Mandrote, so that's what we call him. Smiths are Smiths, and Norrie's sons will be called Norwood's son, if not a trade name. Then why isn't Odel or Norrie named after their fathers? Liam asked as the two arrived at the gate. Trade names. People who travel a lot will often use their hometown as a surname when away from home. There might be 5 or 6 Liams in Roycastle, let's say, but the chances of them all being a Smith are low. So if you know a Liam of Roycastle, and you know he's a Smith, chances are he's the only Smith named that in the city. When you get closer to his home, you'd stop looking for Liam of Royce Castle, and you'd start looking for Liam Smith. Denholm paused at the iron gate. But Odel is still known as Odel of Stossen in town? Things get peculiar when you start talking about adventurers and what they call themselves. Denholm's palms slid through the air in front of him in a sign he refused to broach the subject. With them, it's best to just call them whatever they say and move on. Speaking of, Liam hesitated as he looked past the gate out onto the streets of Stossen. You should go report in for them, Denholm finished Liam's thought. Unfinished sentences seemed to bother the priest. He had a tendency of plucking them out of the air and wrapping them up for anyone who left them floating in space for too long. You did agree to it. I know. Liam had no hesitation about the act of reporting into the guild for the men who had saved him. If anything, he felt that the guild should know about their heroic actions, even if it was par for the course in their line of work. I'd be tired of telling that story already, too. Denholm patted Liam on the shoulder again before turning back and walking into the garden. Liam of Carcanne was written and read for you by Will Hansen. For more information on Liam or any of Will's other works, please visit the Wooks Books Facebook page, Twitter, or YouTube channel. If you'd like to show your support, please like, subscribe, rate, and leave a comment where available. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you next time.